I remember the sound of rain that Sunday morning. Gentle, persistent, like fingers tapping against the kitchen window of my small apartment. The kind of rain that makes the world feel smaller, more intimate. I stood there in my bare feet, pouring coffee into the same blue mug I'd used every morning for the past 3 years, watching the steam rise and disappear. The silence felt heavier than usual. Sundays always did that to me. Stretched the quiet until it became something I could almost touch. I opened the drawer next to the sink, the one that stuck a little and required a certain angle to pull smoothly. Inside, folded with the kind of care reserved for something precious, was the hoodie. Gray cotton, soft from years of washing. The drawstrings were frayed at the ends where nervous fingers had worried them. I lifted it out slowly, as if sudden movements might disturb whatever ghost lived in its fibers. When I held it to my face, I could still catch the faintest trace of something that wasn't quite my detergent, wasn't quite my soap. Something that belonged to someone else entirely. The care package had been sitting on my counter for 2 days. A shoebox wrapped in brown paper, address written in my careful handwriting. Inside, the hoodie, a mix CD with songs I'd burned 3 times before getting the track order right, and a letter I'd written and rewritten until the words felt smooth as river stones. The letter I couldn't bring myself to sign. The letter that said it was fine if he didn't write back, that I just wanted him to have this. I closed my eyes and let myself remember. It was a Tuesday night, maybe 7 years ago. We'd been living together for 3 years by then, sharing that cramped apartment near campus where the heating never worked quite right and the neighbors played music too loud. Gabriel had been in the shower when I got home from work, and I could hear him humming something off-key through the thin walls. I was grading papers on the couch when he emerged, hair still damp and curling at the ends, wearing my hoodie. He moved through the living room like he always did, casual, unconscious of how he filled a space. The hoodie hung loose on his frame, sleeves pushed up to his elbows. He stopped in front of me, running a hand through his wet hair, and said it almost like a confession. "It smells like you," he said, tugging at the fabric near his collarbone. "Mind if I keep it on?" I remember looking up from my papers, pen frozen in my hand. The question hung between us like something delicate and dangerous, something that could shatter if I breathed too hard. There was something in his eyes I couldn't name then, didn't dare to name. A softness that made my chest tight. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and watched him smile. That slow, easy smile that had been undoing me for years. He settled onto the couch beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him through the cotton. Close enough that when he leaned over to see what I was grading, his shoulder brushed mine. He stayed there for the rest of the evening, wearing my clothes like they belonged to him, like we were something more than just friends splitting rent. Now, standing in my kitchen with that same hoodie in my hands, I wondered if he remembered that night the way I did. If he remembered the careful distance I maintained while wanting to close it. If he remembered how I watched him from the corner of my eye, memorizing the way the fabric moved when he breathed. I set the hoodie down on the counter next to the package. On my refrigerator, held by a magnet shaped like Oregon, was a photo we'd taken at someone's birthday party. Gabriel grinning at the camera, arms slung around my shoulders. Me looking somewhere just past the lens, caught in the space between wanting to be closer and knowing I couldn't be. I walked over and turned the photo face down. The rain continued its quiet percussion against the window. In the distance, I heard the sound of Mrs. Chen's mailbox closing with its familiar squeak. The sound reminded me that the post office would be closed today, that the package would have to wait another day. I returned to the couch and sat in the same spot where Gabriel used to curl up with his laptop, legs tucked under him, stealing glances at me over his screen. The cushion beside me felt impossibly empty. The letter remained unsent. The hoodie remained on my counter, holding all the words I'd never been brave enough to say. That Monday morning, I did what I always did. Made coffee in the same blue mug, watered the ferns by the window, checked my lesson plans twice. My apartment in Portland was small but deliberately arranged. Books organized by color, plants positioned to catch the morning light, everything in its place. Colleagues at school called me meticulous. Students said I was the teacher who remembered their birthdays and never raised his voice. I taught high school art in a brick building that smelled like tempera paint and teenage ambition. Room 237, third floor, windows facing east. For 8 years, I'd stood in front of those same whiteboards, guiding 16-year-olds through perspective drawing and color theory. They trusted me with their sketchbooks, their fumbling attempts at self-expression. Some even trusted me with their secrets. Last spring, a student named Marcus had lingered after class, shifting his weight from foot to foot before asking if I thought his parents would understand if he told them something important. I'd sat on the edge of my desk, hands folded, and said that some truths take time to find their right moment. He nodded and left without saying more. 2 weeks later, he brought me a drawing of two boys holding hands, rendered in careful charcoal strokes. He never said another word about it, but sometimes he'd catch my eye during class and smile. I envied his courage. At 34, I'd built a life of careful distances and polite deflections. Dinner parties where I brought wine and listened more than I spoke. Faculty meetings where I offered thoughtful input and left promptly afterward. Church on Sundays, sitting in the same pew, nodding at familiar faces, but never lingering for coffee hour. My neighbors knew me as the quiet man in 4B who collected packages for them when they traveled and never played music loud enough to hear through the walls. Mrs. Chun from downstairs brought me soup when I had the flu and asked gentle questions about whether I was lonely. I always said I preferred the quiet. The truth was more complicated. In my bedroom closet, shirts hung arranged by season and color. In my desk drawer, a photo album with pages missing from the years I lived with Gabriel. Those 5 years felt too dangerous to document, too precious to discard entirely. I'd removed every picture of us together and stored them in a shoebox I kept under my bed, where I wouldn't accidentally glimpse them during ordinary moments. Gabriel had been my roommate from 24 to 29. We'd found each other through a classified ad in the college newspaper. Responsible graduate student seeking same to share rent. He was studying journalism, all easy confidence and quick wit. I was finishing my teaching certification, already learning to measure my words. He dated women with the kind of casual frequency that suggested it meant everything and nothing to him. Sarah with the red hair who laughed too loud at movies. Jessica who left her earrings on our bathroom counter and cooked elaborate meals that filled the apartment with garlic and possibility. Amanda who stayed over most weekends and stocked our refrigerator with expensive yogurt. I learned to time my showers around their schedules. Learned to wear headphones when the thin walls couldn't contain their intimacy. Learned to smile and nod when Gabriel asked what I thought of whoever he was seeing, as if my opinion on his romantic life was casual data instead of a knife being slowly turned. For 5 years, I perfected the art of loving someone who would never love me back. I memorized the sound of his key in the lock, the pattern of his morning routine, the way he hummed when he was happy. I bought groceries he liked and pretended it was coincidence. I stayed up late when he had deadlines, keeping him company with cups of coffee and questions about his articles. He moved out the month after graduation, following a job offer to Seattle. We'd loaded his belongings into a borrowed truck on a Saturday in July, the summer heat making everything shimmer. When he hugged me goodbye, I held on a moment too long and felt him notice. He'd stepped back with a puzzled expression, as if trying to solve an equation that didn't quite balance. For 3 years after that, we exchanged emails and holiday cards, brief updates about new jobs and new cities. He got married 2 years ago to someone named Claire, a photographer he'd met at a coffee shop. The wedding announcement arrived in my mailbox on a Tuesday, complete with their engagement photo, Gabriel grinning at the camera while Claire laughed at something just outside the frame. I'd written 3 different responses to that announcement and sent none of them. Instead, I bought them a serving bowl from their registry and had it shipped with a card that said simply, "Congratulations. Wishing you happiness. Julian." Our correspondence dwindled after that. A text on his birthday. A brief exchange when my father died, and he somehow heard about it through mutual friends. Nothing substantial. Nothing that required either of us to be vulnerable. Until last Thursday evening, when I opened my laptop to find an email with his name in my inbox. The subject line read, Portland. Hey, he had written. I know it's been a while. I'm coming to Portland next week for work. just for the weekend. Would you want to meet up? Coffee or something? It would be good to see you. I'd read it 7 times before closing the laptop. Opened it again an hour later and read it 12 more times, analyzing the casual tone, the careful phrasing. Coffee or something? Good to see you. Nothing that committed him to more than politeness between old friends. My cursor blinked in the reply field for 20 minutes while I drafted and deleted responses. Too eager, too distant, too honest about how that simple email had unraveled every careful boundary I'd spent years constructing. 3 days later, I still hadn't replied. The care package sat on my counter like a question I couldn't answer. Gabriel's email waited in my inbox like a door I wasn't sure I was brave enough to open. I finally replied to Gabriel's email on Friday morning, 2 cups of coffee deep and running out of ways to avoid the inevitable. My response was carefully neutral, a suggestion to meet at Café Nell, a quiet bistro downtown where the tables were far enough apart for private conversation. I chose Saturday at 1 o'clock, early enough to feel casual, late enough to suggest I had other plans afterward even though I didn't. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting at a corner table with his back to the wall. 7 years had changed him in subtle ways that hit me like small revelations. His hair was shorter, more deliberately styled. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, and his shoulders carried a weight that seemed heavier than I remembered. He wore a navy sweater that looked expensive and unfamiliar. But when he smiled at me across the restaurant, it was the same smile that had been undoing me since we were 24. We hugged briefly at the table, a careful embrace that lasted exactly long enough to be polite and not a moment longer. He smelled different too, like cologne I didn't recognize and coffee that wasn't the brand we used to share. I sat across from him and tried to reconcile this slightly older, more polished version with the man who used to eat cereal for dinner and leave his socks on the living room floor. The conversation came easier than I'd expected. We talked about work, his job at a newspaper in Seattle, my students, and their latest artistic disasters. He laughed when I told him about the sophomore who tried to paint a sunset using only brown tempera paint, insisting it was his artistic vision. For a moment, it felt like no time had passed at all. But there were gaps now, careful spaces around certain topics. When I asked about Seattle, he described the city's coffee culture and rain patterns, but not much about his life there. When he asked about my weekends, I mentioned hiking trails and farmers markets, but nothing about the long stretches of solitude that filled my apartment. It was Gabriel who brought up the Halloween party. We'd been talking about college when his face lit up with recognition, and he said he'd been thinking about that night when we got caught in that terrible storm. Do you remember, he asked, how we ended up soaked through walking back from that party off campus? You lent me that gray hoodie because I was shivering in the hallway. I remembered everything about that night. The way his costume, some half-hearted vampire thing, had been ruined by the rain. How he'd stood in our tiny bathroom, hair dripping, while I found him dry clothes. The way he'd looked at me when I handed him the hoodie, something grateful and vulnerable in his expression. How we'd sat up until 3 in the morning, talking about nothing important while he wore my clothes like they were a natural extension of his skin. I told him I remembered, and he smiled with something that looked almost wistful. We were so young then, he said, and something in his voice made me look at him more carefully. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper in the afternoon light filtering through the restaurant windows. He mentioned his wife only once, when I asked about the move to Seattle. Claire had family there, he said, and she'd wanted to be closer to them. His smile when he said her name was thin, automatic, like a response he'd practiced. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. Near the end of lunch, Gabriel rubbed his temples and mentioned that he was staying at some chain hotel downtown, the kind with thin walls and air conditioning that cycled on and off all night. He said he never slept well in hotels, that the unfamiliar sounds kept him awake. There was something in the way he said it that felt like an invitation, though perhaps that was just wishful thinking on my part. I found myself offering my couch before I'd fully decided to do it. Like old times, I said, trying to keep my voice casual. If you want. I have a spare blanket. He accepted without hesitation, as if he'd been waiting for me to ask. Said he'd need to grab his bag from the hotel, but that sounded perfect. Better than perfect, actually. Walking back to my apartment, we fell into the rhythm we'd had years ago, Gabriel talking with his hands, me listening and adding commentary when the conversation called for it. But there was an undercurrent now that hadn't existed when we were roommates. Or perhaps it had existed, and I'd been too afraid to acknowledge it. In my living room, everything felt smaller with Gabriel in it again. He examined my bookshelves like he was reacquainting himself with an old friend, running his finger along the spines. When he pulled out a collection of poetry I'd been reading, I watched him flip through pages and noticed the lines I'd underlined. He read one aloud, something about the weight of unspoken words, and his eyes found mine across the room. We ordered Chinese food and ate it sitting on the floor in front of my coffee table, just like we used to. Gabriel talked about his articles, the stories he'd been covering, but his voice carried a fatigue that hadn't been there during lunch. When I asked if everything was okay, he paused with his chopsticks halfway to his mouth and said he was just tired from traveling. But his eyes lingered on my face like he was trying to decide whether to say something more. As the evening stretched on, we migrated to the couch. Gabriel sat closer than necessary, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him through the space between us. When he reached for the remote to help me find something to watch, his hand brushed mine, and neither of us moved away immediately. Later, after we'd settled on some documentary neither of us was really watching, I brought him a pillow and the spare blanket from my closet. He was standing in the doorway between the living room and my bedroom, and in the dim light from the hallway, he looked almost exactly like he had 7 years ago. That's when he asked about the hoodie. The gray one, he said, and something in his voice made my chest tight. Do you still have it? I told him it was in the bottom drawer of my dresser, the same place it had always been. He disappeared into my bedroom for a few minutes, and when he returned, he was wearing it. The sight of him in my clothes again after all these years felt like being punched and embraced simultaneously. He stood there in my living room, tugging at the fabric near his collarbone exactly the way he had that night 7 years ago. It smells like you, he said, so quietly I almost didn't hear him. Mind if I keep it on? This time, I couldn't even nod. I just stood there, memorizing the way the gray cotton hung on his frame, the way his eyes held mine across the space between us. Something in the air felt different than it had before, charged with possibilities I didn't dare name. He smiled that slow, careful smile and settled back onto the couch. I turned off the lights and went to my bedroom, but I could feel the weight of him in my living room, wearing my clothes, breathing in my space. Through the thin walls, I could hear him shifting against the cushions, settling in for the night. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and trying not to think about how perfectly he still fit into the space he'd left behind. I woke Sunday morning to the sound of Gabriel humming in my kitchen. For a moment, still caught between sleep and consciousness, it felt like no time had passed at all. Like I was 26 again, listening to him make coffee before his early shift at the campus paper. Then I heard him open the cabinet where I kept the mugs, and reality settled back into place. He was wearing the hoodie still, sleeves pushed up to his elbows, hair sticking up in directions that suggested he'd slept as restlessly as I had. When I appeared in the doorway, he looked up from the coffee maker with that same slightly sheepish expression he used to wear on weekend mornings when we'd both stayed up too late talking. "Good morning," he said, and handed me the blue mug without being asked. He remembered. We spent the morning walking through Portland's downtown core, past the food trucks and weekend farmers market, through Pioneer Courthouse Square, where street musicians played for clusters of tourists. Gabriel commented on how much the city had changed since his last visit, but I found myself watching his hands more than the scenery. The way he gestured when he talked, the unconscious habit he had of biting his bottom lip when he was thinking. Our conversation moved easily between past and present, but there were silences now that felt different than they used to. Heavier, loaded with things neither of us was saying. When we stopped at a crosswalk, Gabriel stood close enough that our shoulders brushed, and he didn't step away when the light changed. At Powell's Books, we wandered the poetry section together. Gabriel pulled volumes from shelves, reading passages aloud in the hushed cathedral of words. When he found a collection by a poet I'd never heard of, he bought it without looking at the price. At the checkout counter, he borrowed a pen from the cashier and opened to a page somewhere in the middle. He underlined something quickly, then handed the book to me. I read the marked passage twice before the words fully registered. I didn't know I could miss someone before they left. When I looked up, Gabriel was studying my face with an intensity that made my chest tight. He said nothing about the line he'd chosen, just smiled that careful smile and suggested we find somewhere for lunch. But I carried those words with me for the rest of the afternoon, turning them over in my mind like stones worn smooth by water. I didn't know I could miss someone before they left. As if anticipatory grief was something Gabriel understood too well. We spent the late afternoon back at my apartment. Gabriel sprawled on the couch with his laptop while I graded papers at the kitchen table. It was so familiar it hurt. This easy domestic rhythm we'd perfected years ago without ever acknowledging what it meant. Every so often, I'd catch him watching me over his screen, but he'd look away when our eyes met. Around 6, I suggested we cook dinner together. Gabriel's face lit up with the kind of genuine pleasure that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with him in the first place. He rolled up his sleeves and started pulling ingredients from my refrigerator like he still lived there, like he had every right to make himself at home in my space. We made pasta with whatever vegetables I had on hand, working around each other in my small kitchen with the practiced ease of people who'd done this 1,000 times before. Gabriel found the wine I kept on top of the refrigerator, the bottle I'd been saving for some special occasion that never seemed to arrive. He opened it without asking, poured 2 glasses, and handed me one with a mock-serious expression. "To old friends," he said, and something in his voice made the toast feel like a question. Music drifted from my speaker, something soft and instrumental that filled the spaces between our words. As the wine loosened our tongues, our conversation grew more honest. Gabriel talked about his job, how he felt like he was writing the same stories over and over. I told him about my students, how some of them reminded me of ourselves at that age, so certain and so fragile at the same time. It was while we were cleaning dishes that Gabriel leaned back against my counter and asked the question that changed everything. He was holding a dish towel, not really drying anything, just looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Do you ever think about those years?" he asked. "Living together, I mean. How easy it was." The words hung between us like something delicate and dangerous. I set down the plate I'd been washing and turned to face him fully. "All the time," I said, because it was true and because the wine had made me braver than usual. Gabriel nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd suspected. "We were good at it," he said, "being together like that. I never wanted to leave that apartment." Something in his voice made me study his face more carefully. There was a vulnerability there I recognized from years ago, the same expression he'd worn that night he'd first put on my hoodie. Like he was testing the waters of a conversation he wasn't sure he was ready to have. The moment stretched between us, full of possibility and terrifying in its openness. I wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to push past the careful phrasing to the truth underneath. But Gabriel looked away first, set down the dish towel, and suggested we watch something. We ended up on the couch again, the wine making us both more relaxed than we'd been since he'd arrived. Gabriel sat closer this time, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him along my side. When he laughed at something on the screen, his hand briefly touched my knee, and the casual intimacy of it sent electricity up my spine. As the evening wore on, we both grew quiet. The documentary we'd chosen became background noise to our shared silence. Gabriel's breathing had grown deeper, more rhythmic, and when I glanced over, his eyes were closed. I must have dozed off too, because when I woke, the apartment was dark except for the blue glow from the television. Gabriel had shifted in his sleep, and his hand had somehow found its way to rest on top of mine. His fingers were warm and slightly calloused, and in the darkness, I could pretend this was intentional, that this touch meant something. I stayed perfectly still, afraid that any movement would break whatever spell had allowed this moment to exist. Gabriel's breathing was deep and even beside me, and in the dim light, his face looked younger, softer, like the man I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. Eventually, my neck began to ache from the awkward position, but I didn't move. I lay there cataloging the weight of Gabriel's hand on mine, the sound of his breathing, the way his presence filled my living room and made it feel less like a carefully curated space and more like a home. When I finally did fall back asleep, it was with Gabriel's hand still covering mine, and for the first time in years, I didn't dream of being alone. I woke before dawn to find Gabriel gone from the couch, his blanket folded neatly on the coffee table. I could hear the shower running and realized he was getting ready for his flight back to Seattle. The reality of his leaving hit me like cold water, and I found myself reaching for my sketchbook almost without thinking. I drew quickly, trying to capture the way he'd looked sleeping beside me, the peaceful expression on his face in the television's blue glow. Then I drew him from yesterday, laughing at something I'd said while we walked through the city. My hand moved without conscious direction, filling page after page with different versions of Gabriel. In my hoodie, reading poetry, standing in my kitchen with wine-flushed cheeks. I'd always been good at portraits, but these felt different, more honest, like I was finally allowing myself to see him clearly, to put on paper what I'd been too afraid to acknowledge in person. Each drawing felt like a small confession, a way of saying everything I couldn't bring myself to speak aloud. When Gabriel emerged from the bathroom, hair damp and wearing his own clothes again, I quickly closed the sketchbook. But something in his expression suggested he'd caught a glimpse of what I'd been doing. He looked at me for a long moment, something unreadable in his eyes, before asking if I could drive him to the airport. The sketchbook sat on my coffee table like evidence of everything I'd never been brave enough to say. The drive to the airport should have taken 30 minutes, but I found myself taking the longer route without consciously deciding to do so. Gabriel sat in my passenger seat, checking his phone and making small talk about his flight, but I could feel something unresolved hanging between us like a question neither of us knew how to ask. At a red light, he mentioned that he'd enjoyed the weekend more than he'd expected, said it felt good to be back in Portland, good to see me again. His voice carried a weight that suggested he meant more than he was saying, but traffic started moving before I could respond. I wanted to tell him that having him in my apartment again had felt like coming home after years of exile. That watching him sleep on my couch had been both the most natural and most heartbreaking thing I'd experienced in recent memory. Instead, I nodded and said something safe about how we should try to stay in better touch. At the departure drop-off, Gabriel hesitated before getting out of the car. He turned to look at me, and for a moment I thought he might say something that would change everything. But a security guard knocked on my window and told me I couldn't idle there, so Gabriel grabbed his bag and stepped onto the sidewalk. He leaned down to my open window and said he'd call when he got back to Seattle. Then he was walking through the automatic doors, and I was driving home through Sunday afternoon traffic, feeling like I'd missed some crucial opportunity without understanding what it had been. Back in my apartment, Gabriel's absence felt more pronounced than it had before his visit. The couch cushions still held the impression of his body. My gray hoodie was folded neatly on my coffee table, and when I held it to my face, it smelled like his cologne mixed with my laundry detergent. I tried to go back to my normal routine, grading papers, meal planning for the week ahead, but my eyes kept drifting to the sketchbook I'd left open on the coffee table. The drawing on the visible page was one I'd done that morning, Gabriel sleeping with his hand resting where mine had been. Even rendered in graphite, there was something intimate about the image that made my chest tight. I'd been drawing him compulsively since he'd left, trying to capture every detail I could remember. The way his hair curled when it was damp from the shower. The expression on his face when he'd read that line of poetry aloud. The careful way he'd held his wine glass, like he was afraid it might break. Monday morning came too soon. I taught my classes on autopilot, going through the motions of demonstrating brush techniques and critiquing student work while my mind wandered back to Gabriel's laugh in my kitchen, the weight of his hand on mine in the darkness. It was during my planning period that my phone buzzed with a text from Gabriel. Landed safely, it said. Thanks for a great weekend. Then, a few minutes later, I think I left my phone charger at your place. Mind checking. I found the charger plugged in by my kitchen counter and texted him back to confirm. Instead of asking me to mail it, he said he'd call later to figure out the logistics. Something about the way he phrased it suggested the charger wasn't really the point. That evening, I was grading papers at my kitchen table when my phone rang. Gabriel's voice sounded different over the distance, smaller somehow, more tentative than it had been in person. We talked about inconsequential things for a while. His flight, the weather in Seattle, my students' latest artistic disasters. But there was an undercurrent to the conversation, like we were both circling around something larger. Eventually, Gabriel asked if I was still drawing. The question caught me off guard, and I found myself admitting that I'd been sketching more lately. Portraits, mostly, I said, which was true even if it wasn't the whole truth. There was a pause on his end, long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then Gabriel said he'd always loved my drawings, that I had a way of seeing people that was almost uncomfortable in its honesty. He said it like a compliment, but there was something in his voice that made me think he was remembering something specific. We hung up with vague promises to talk again soon, but I spent the rest of the evening thinking about that pause, about what Gabriel might have seen in my sketchbook that morning before I'd closed it so quickly. The phone calls became a regular thing over the next 2 weeks. Gabriel would call in the evenings, usually around 9, and we'd talk for an hour or more about everything and nothing. He told me about the stories he was working on, the apartment he and Claire had been renovating. I told him about my students, the art show I was helping organize at school. But there were gaps in these conversations too, subjects we both avoided. Gabriel never mentioned Claire in detail, and I never asked about his marriage directly. We talked around it like a hole in the middle of our dialogue, acknowledging its presence without ever looking directly at it. It was during one of these calls that Gabriel mentioned he might need to come back to Portland for a follow-up story. His editor wanted him to do a deeper dive on the piece he'd been working on during his weekend visit. The possibility hung between us over the phone line, loaded with implications neither of us voiced. When the call came 3 weeks later confirming his return trip, I felt something that was equal parts anticipation and terror. Gabriel said he'd booked a hotel room this time. Didn't want to impose on my hospitality again. But something in his voice suggested he was open to persuasion, and I found myself offering my couch again before I'd thought it through. This time, when Gabriel arrived at my apartment on a Thursday evening, there was a different energy between us. Less surprise, more intention. We both knew we were choosing to be in this space together, choosing to navigate whatever it was that existed between us. I'd cleaned obsessively before his arrival, though my apartment was already immaculate. I'd also hidden my sketchbook in my bedroom, not wanting a repeat of that almost discovery from his last visit. But I'd forgotten about the loose drawings I'd left on my desk, studies I'd been working on throughout the week. Gabriel was helping me clear dishes from dinner when he noticed them. I'd gone to the kitchen to start coffee, and when I returned, he was standing perfectly still by my desk, holding one of the sketches in his hands. It was the drawing I'd done of him sleeping on my couch, the one that captured something vulnerable and unguarded in his expression. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then Gabriel looked up at me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. "It's beautiful," he said quietly, and folded the paper carefully along its original creases. He set it down gently, like it was something precious that might break. The silence stretched between us, full of everything we'd never said. Gabriel ran a hand through his hair and walked to the window, looking out at the street below. When he spoke again, his voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. "I used to wonder," he said without turning around, "after I moved out, why I never wanted to leave that apartment. Why every place I lived after felt wrong somehow, like I was wearing clothes that didn't fit." My heart was beating so hard I was sure he could hear it across the room. I wanted to say something, but my throat felt closed off, like all my words had gotten stuck somewhere between my chest and my mouth. Gabriel turned to face me then, and I saw that his eyes were bright with something that looked like tears. "I think I always knew," he said, "about how you felt. I just didn't want it to be true, because I didn't know what that would make me, what it would mean for us." The confession hung between us like something fragile and dangerous. All the careful distance I'd maintained over the years crumbled in an instant, and I found myself saying the words I'd kept locked away for nearly a decade. "I loved you," I said, and my voice came out rougher than I'd intended. "I still do, maybe, I'm sorry. Gabriel's face crumpled slightly, and he took a step toward me. Don't apologize, he said. Please don't apologize for that. We stood there in my living room, 2 feet apart, but feeling like miles, while the truth settled between us like dust after an earthquake. Gabriel's hands were shaking slightly, and I could see him trying to find words for something he'd never said aloud. I felt it too, he whispered finally. I still do. I think about those mornings when I'd wake up and you'd already made coffee, and it felt more like home than anywhere I've lived since. I think about that night with the hoodie, how much I wanted to stay on that couch with you instead of going to my room alone. Neither of us moved to close the distance between us. This wasn't about physical touch. It was about something deeper, more fundamental. It was about finally naming the thing that had been living in the space between us for years, the thing that had made every other relationship feel like settling for less. We sat down on opposite ends of my couch, facing each other in the lamplight, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt completely seen by another person. The relief of it was overwhelming, like being able to breathe deeply after years of holding my breath. We talked until nearly 3 in the morning, sitting on opposite ends of my couch like we were afraid that getting too close might break whatever spell had allowed us to finally speak the truth. Gabriel told me about the years after he'd moved away, how he'd measured every relationship against something he couldn't name, how nothing had ever felt quite right. I told him about the careful life I'd built, the way I'd learned to love people at a safe distance, the loneliness that had become so familiar I'd mistaken it for contentment. When we finally went to sleep, Gabriel on the couch and me in my bedroom, I lay awake listening to the sound of his breathing through the thin walls. Everything felt different now that the words had been spoken, like the air in my apartment had changed composition. But I also felt a creeping dread about what morning would bring, what reality would look like in daylight. I woke to the sound of Gabriel moving quietly around my living room, trying not to wake me. When I emerged from my bedroom, he was folding the blanket with the kind of precise movements that suggested nervous energy. His suitcase sat by the door, already packed. The train to Seattle left at 11:30, which meant he needed to leave my apartment in less than 2 hours. We made breakfast in relative silence, both of us moving carefully around the conversation we'd had the night before. Gabriel kept checking his phone, and I found myself watching the clock on my stove, counting down the minutes until he'd have to leave. When he finally spoke, it was while we were sitting at my small kitchen table, coffee growing cold in our mugs. He said he'd been thinking about what we'd talked about what it meant. His voice was quiet, measured, like he'd been rehearsing these words in his head. I'm not ready to blow up my life, he said, looking directly at me. I wish I was, but I'm not. The honesty of it hit me like a physical blow, but I understood. Gabriel had built a life in Seattle, had made commitments and promises that couldn't be undone with a single conversation. I looked across the table at him, this man I'd loved for nearly a decade, and felt something settle into place that was equal parts heartbreak and acceptance. I'm not asking you to, I said, and meant it. This wasn't about ultimatums or dramatic gestures. It was about finally naming what had always been true, even if that truth couldn't change everything. Gabriel's shoulders sagged with what looked like relief. He reached across the table and covered my hand with his. And for a moment we sat there connected by touch and understanding and the weight of everything we couldn't change. We decided to walk through the city one more time before he had to catch his train. It was one of those perfect Portland mornings, crisp and clear, with Mount Hood visible in the distance like a postcard of itself. We walked slowly, neither of us eager to reach any particular destination. Gabriel talked about his work, the story he'd come to research, but his heart wasn't in it. Eventually we found ourselves in Laurelhurst Park, following the path around the pond where families fed ducks and couples sat on benches reading Sunday papers. If I stayed, Gabriel said suddenly, stopping near a cluster of oak trees whose leaves were just beginning to turn. If I just didn't get on that train, I don't know what I'd become. We stood facing each other on the path while joggers and dog walkers moved around us like we were stones in a stream. Gabriel's hands were shoved deep in his pockets, and he was looking at me with an expression that was part question, part plea. You'd still be you, I said. Just not the version you've been pretending to be. Something flickered across Gabriel's face. Pain, maybe, or recognition. He looked away, toward the pond where a blue heron stood motionless in the shallows, waiting for fish that might never come. That's what scares me, he said quietly. We walked the rest of the way to Union Station in something that wasn't quite silence, but wasn't really conversation either. Gabriel's train was already boarding when we arrived, and passengers were moving past us in the kind of efficient hurry that train stations always seem to inspire. At the gate, Gabriel turned to face me, and I could see him struggling with something. For a moment, I thought he might change his mind, might step back from the threshold and choose something different. But then the conductor announced final boarding, and whatever moment we'd been balanced on the edge of disappeared. Gabriel hugged me then, and it wasn't the careful embrace we'd shared at the restaurant the day before. This was desperate, urgent, like he was trying to memorize the feeling of holding me. His arms wrapped around me tight enough that I could feel his heartbeat against my chest, could smell the familiar scent of my detergent still clinging to his clothes. He held on for long enough that other passengers had to move around us. When he finally stepped back, his eyes were bright with tears he wasn't letting fall. He picked up his suitcase without saying anything, because what was there left to say? I watched him walk through the gate and disappear into the train car. Through the windows, I could see him finding his seat, stowing his bag, settling in for the 4-hour journey back to the life he'd chosen. He didn't look back toward the platform, didn't search for me through the glass. The train pulled away exactly on schedule, picking up speed as it curved north toward the Columbia River. I stood on the platform long after it had disappeared, long after the other passengers had dispersed and the station had returned to its usual quiet efficiency. A maintenance worker eventually asked if I was waiting for someone, and I realized I'd been standing there for nearly an hour. I told him no, I wasn't waiting for anyone, which was true in the most literal sense. Gabriel was gone, back to Seattle and his wife and the life he'd built there. There was nothing left to wait for. But walking back to my car, I felt something I hadn't expected. Alongside the grief and loss, there was something that felt almost like relief. We'd finally said the words that had been living between us for years. Gabriel knew how I felt, and I knew that he felt it too. The secret I'd carried alone for so long wasn't mine anymore. It would have to be enough. The drive home took longer than usual because I kept having to pull over when my vision blurred with tears I hadn't seen coming. In my apartment, Gabriel's absence felt different than it had after his first visit. Less like an ending, more like something that had been completed. I found myself at my desk that evening, sketching again. But this time I wasn't drawing Gabriel. I was drawing the heron we'd seen in the park, standing patient and still in the shallow water, waiting for something that might never come, but waiting nonetheless. There was something beautiful about its stillness, its willingness to hope without certainty. When I finished the drawing, I set it next to the others I'd done of Gabriel over the past few weeks. They looked different now, like artifacts from a period of my life that had officially ended. Not bitter or regretful, just complete. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe all the way down to the bottom of my lungs. 3 weeks passed before the package arrived. I'd fallen back into my routine by then, teaching, grading papers, tending to my plants with the kind of attention that suggested I was learning to be alone in a different way than before. The apartment felt like mine again, but not in the same careful, curated sense it had before Gabriel's visit. It felt lived in, less like a museum of my own solitude. The box was small, wrapped in brown paper with my name written in Gabriel's familiar handwriting. No return address, but I knew it was from him before I opened it. Inside, folded with the same care I'd once used, was my gray hoodie. It smelled like laundry detergent I didn't recognize, and something else, something that might have been goodbye. Underneath the hoodie was a photograph I'd forgotten existed. The two of us at someone's graduation party, Gabriel's arm around my shoulders, both of us squinting into afternoon sunlight. I was looking slightly away from the camera, but Gabriel was grinning directly into the lens with the kind of unguarded joy that belonged to a younger version of himself. The note was brief, written on a piece of hotel stationery in Gabriel's careful script. I wasn't ready then. But I was honest with her. She knows. Maybe someday, but I understand if that's asking too much. Thank you for letting me finally say it. Keep drawing. I read the note 3 times before its full meaning settled. Gabriel had told Claire about us, about what he'd discovered during his time in Portland. The courage that must have required made my chest tight with something that was equal parts admiration and heartbreak. He'd chosen honesty over safety, even knowing it might cost him everything. I folded the hoodie gently and placed it back in the bottom drawer where it had lived for so many years. But this time, it didn't feel like I was hiding evidence of something shameful. It felt like I was putting away something precious that had served its purpose. That Saturday morning, I took my sketchbook to Laurelhurst Park for the first time since Gabriel had left. I sat on the same bench where we'd watched the heron, but instead of searching for him in the landscape, I found myself drawing what was actually in front of me. A couple walking their dog, the woman's hand resting on the man's arm. 2 teenagers sharing earbuds and laughing at something on a phone screen. An elderly man feeding pigeons with the kind of patient attention that suggested this was a daily ritual. My lines felt different than they had in years. More certain, less apologetic. I wasn't drawing to capture something I was afraid of losing anymore. I was drawing because the world around me was worth noticing, worth documenting, worth celebrating in all its ordinary complexity. When a young couple sat down on the bench across from me, the woman leaning into her partner's shoulder while he read aloud from a paperback novel, I drew them too. Not because they reminded me of something I couldn't have, but because there was something beautiful in their easy intimacy, in the way they'd found each other and chosen to build something together. The afternoon light was beginning to slant through the trees when my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, the student who'd drawn the 2 boys holding hands. He was starting college in the fall and wanted to know if I'd write him a recommendation letter. Of course, I replied, and found myself smiling at the thought of this brave young man stepping into his own truth with a confidence I was still learning. As I walked home through the familiar streets of my neighborhood, I realized something had shifted in the weeks since Gabriel's departure. The loneliness that had been my constant companion for years hadn't disappeared, but it had changed shape. It felt less like a wound and more like a choice I was making consciously, day by day. Mrs. Chun was watering her garden when I reached my building, and she waved me over with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested she had news to share. Her nephew was visiting from San Francisco next week, she said, and he was about my age and loved art. Perhaps I'd like to join them for dinner. For the first time in years, I didn't automatically decline. Maybe, I said, surprising both of us. That would be nice. In my apartment that evening, I spread my drawings from the park across my coffee table. They were good, better than anything I'd drawn in months. There was a life in them that had been missing from my work, a sense of engagement with the world rather than retreat from it. I thought about Gabriel, probably sitting in his own living room 300 miles north, navigating the new landscape of his marriage with the honesty he'd finally found the courage to offer. I hoped Claire would understand, hoped they'd find a way forward that honored the truth he'd given her. But even if they didn't, Gabriel had chosen authenticity over comfort, and there was something beautiful in that choice regardless of its outcome. The care package I prepared weeks ago still sat on my kitchen counter, the one with the mixed CD and the unsigned letter. I picked it up and carried it to my desk, then took out a pen and added my name to the bottom of the letter. Not because I expected Gabriel to respond, but because the gesture felt complete now. Whatever happened next, we'd both chosen truth over safety, and that was enough. I sealed the package and set it aside to mail on Monday. Outside my window, the city continued its evening rhythm. People heading home from work, couples meeting for dinner, friends gathering in restaurants and bars to share the stories of their days. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt like I was part of that rhythm rather than watching it from a distance. The hoodie remained folded in my drawer, but it no longer felt like a shrine to something I couldn't have. It felt like a reminder of something I'd been brave enough to name, something that had changed both of us in ways we were still discovering. And that, I realized, was more than enough to build a life on.